Black family takes group picture in 1920. 105 years later, experts zoom in and were speechless. Dr. Lena Chambers adjusted her reading glasses and stepped back to survey the walls of the university gallery. After 3 months of meticulous planning, her exhibit, Ordinary Lives, Extraordinary Legacy, was finally taking shape. The collection featured dozens of African American family portraits from the early 20th century, each one telling a story of resilience, dignity, and quiet strength during one of America's most challenging eras. As the head curator of African American Studies at Emory University, Dr. Chambers had dedicated her career to preserving these forgotten narratives. But today, as she examined the photographs one final time before the exhibit's opening, something felt incomplete. The portraits were beautiful, historically significant, but they lacked that one extraordinary piece that would transform viewers from casual observers into deeply moved witnesses of history. Her assistant, Marcus, wheeled in another cart of framed photographs. "Dr. Chambers, we just received the final donation from the Harris family estate. The descendants wanted these included in the exhibit." Dr. Chambers nodded absently, still focused on the arrangement of existing pieces. The Harris donation had arrived just 2 weeks ago, a collection of family photographs spanning from 1900 to 1950, donated by distant relatives who lived in Atlanta. She'd briefly reviewed them and found them historically valuable, but nothing had stood out as exceptional. "Just place them on my desk," she said. "I'll review them tonight." But something nagged at her. Maybe it was the perfectionist in her, or perhaps the historian's instinct that had served her well over 15 years of research. She walked over to the cart and picked up the largest frame. The photograph was stunning in its clarity, remarkably well preserved for something taken in 1920. 15 family members were arranged in 3 careful rows in front of a modest wooden home in rural Georgia. The composition was typical of the era: men in their finest dark suits, women in elegant dresses with intricate details, children seated formally on the ground. Everyone looked directly at the camera with the serious expressions common in early photography, when holding still for long exposures was necessary. But as Dr. Chambers studied the image more closely, her attention was drawn to the elderly man seated prominently in the center of the middle row. While every other person in the photograph had their hands folded naturally or resting on their knees, this man, clearly the family patriarch, held something against his chest with both hands. Something important enough that he'd refused to let go of it even for the formal family portrait. Dr. Chambers felt her pulse quicken. In her years of studying historical photographs, she'd learned that every detail mattered. People in the early 1900s didn't casually include random objects in formal portraits. If something appeared in the frame, it was there for a reason. She carried the photograph to her office and placed it under her high-powered magnifying lamp, the same equipment she used for examining centuries-old documents. As the bright light illuminated the image, details became clearer. The object in the man's hands was definitely a folded document, not a book, not a letter, but something official with what appeared to be a wax seal visible along one edge. Her curiosity now fully awakened, Dr. Chambers moved to her computer and began the process she'd perfected over years of historical research. Using specialized scanner capable of detecting details invisible to the naked eye, she created a digital version of the photograph at maximum resolution. The university had invested in cutting-edge image enhancement software specifically for historical preservation, and she'd become expert at coaxing secrets from old photographs. As the scanning completed, Dr. Chambers opened the digital file and slowly zoomed in on the mysterious document. The enhancement program analyzed every pixel, clarifying text that had been obscured by time, shadow, and the limitations of 1920s photography. What she saw made her hands tremble. At the top of the folded paper, previously illegible text became crystal clear. Property title, Fulton County, GA. Below that, a date that seemed to glow on her screen, April 1904. And there, partially visible where the document was folded, she could make out a signature line with Thomas Harris, written in formal script. Dr. Chambers leaned back in her chair, her mind racing. She'd spent her entire career studying the challenges faced by African American families in the early 1900s, particularly in the South. Property ownership during that era was not just rare for black families. It was revolutionary. It represented economic independence, generational wealth, and a level of success that directly challenged the social order of post-Reconstruction America. Yet here, in a simple family photograph, was evidence that Thomas Harris had owned property in Fulton County, the Atlanta area, in 1904. The implications were staggering. She turned the frame over, hoping for additional information. On the back, in faded blue ink, someone had written, "Harris Family Reunion, Summer 1920. Papa Thomas, 79 years old." Below that, in different handwriting that looked more recent, "The day Papa showed us the deed to our land." Our land. Dr. Chambers felt the familiar electricity that coursed through her whenever she discovered something historically significant. This wasn't just a family portrait. It was potentially evidence of black land ownership during one of the most oppressive periods in American history. But if the Harris family had owned property, what had happened to it? Why were distant relatives donating photographs to a university exhibit instead of inheriting family land worth potentially millions in today's Atlanta real estate market? She picked up her phone and scrolled through her recent contacts until she found the number for Denise Williams, one of the Harris descendants who had donated the photographs. When she'd called 2 weeks ago to arrange the donation, the conversation had been brief and businesslike. Now, Dr. Chambers realized she needed to have a very different kind of conversation. The phone rang several times before a woman's voice answered. "Hello? Ms. Williams, this is Dr. Lena Chambers from Emory University. We spoke about your family's photograph donation for the exhibit." "Oh yes, Dr. Chambers. Is everything all right? Did we forget to include something?" Dr. Chambers looked at the photograph again, at Thomas Harris's proud, dignified expression and the document he held so carefully. "Ms. Williams, I need to ask you something that might sound unusual. What do you know about your family owning property in the early 1900s? There was a long pause on the other end of the line. "Property? Dr. Chambers, I think there might be some confusion. My great-grandparents were sharecroppers. They never owned anything. That's why this exhibit means so much to us. It's the only way we can honor their memory." Dr. Chambers stared at the image on her computer screen, at the clear text reading, "Property title," at the signature of Thomas Harris, at the notation about "Our land." "Ms. Williams," she said carefully, "I think we need to talk." 3 days later, Denise Williams sat across from Dr. Chambers in the university conference room, her hands wrapped tightly around a cup of coffee that had long since gone cold. Beside her, her cousin Terrence shifted uncomfortably in his chair, occasionally glancing at the enlarged photograph displayed on the wall-mounted screen. "I still can't believe it," Denise whispered for the third time since arriving. "All these years, Mama told us stories about great-great-grandpa Thomas, but she always said he was just a sharecropper. Worked other people's land his whole life." Terrence leaned forward, squinting at the enhanced image of the document in Thomas Harris's hands. "You're absolutely certain that says property title? I mean, the photo's over 100 years old." Dr. Chambers nodded confidently. "The image enhancement technology we use is the same system employed by the FBI for forensic analysis. There's no doubt about what we're seeing here. Your great-great-grandfather was holding a property deed dated April 1904. The room fell silent except for the gentle hum of the air conditioning. Finally, Denise spoke up. "Dr. Chambers, what exactly are you suggesting? That our family owned land and somehow lost it? That's exactly what I'm suggesting. And I think we need to find out what happened to it." What followed was an emotional journey that would consume the next 2 months of their lives. Denise and Terrence, both in their 50s with grown children and established careers, found themselves spending weekends driving to Denise's childhood home in South Atlanta, sorting through boxes of family documents that had been stored in her late grandmother's attic for decades. The first breakthrough came on a sweltering Saturday afternoon in June. Terrence was going through a shoebox filled with yellowed envelopes when he found a bundle of letters tied with a faded ribbon. The return address on several envelopes read, "Thomas Harris, RFD Route 3, Atlanta, Georgia." "Denise, come look at this," he called out, his voice tight with excitement. The letters, written in careful cursive on thin paper, were correspondence between Thomas Harris and various family members between 1918 and 1925. Most discussed typical family matters: births, deaths, church events, weather. But 3 letters contained references that made their hearts race. In a 1922 letter to his daughter Sarah, Thomas wrote, "The property up near the tracks is doing well this year. Cotton prices are good, and I was able to pay the taxes early. Tell the children they're welcome to visit the land anytime they want to see what their grandfather built for them." Another letter, dated 1924, mentioned, "Had to fix the fence again where it meets the railroad property. Those trains shake everything loose, but I'm not complaining. Having land next to the railroad means it'll be worth something someday." The most significant find was a small metal box hidden beneath layers of old quilts. Inside were tax receipts, dozens of them, dating from 1905 to 1928. Each one clearly showed Thomas Harris as the property owner of a 3-acre parcel described as Lot 47, Fulton County Tax District 12. "My God!" Denise breathed, holding up a 1927 receipt. He was paying property taxes for over 20 years. This isn't just a story, this is proof. Armed with this evidence, they contacted Dr. Chambers, who connected them with Sarah Mitchell, a local archivist who specialized in Atlanta area property records. Sarah's excitement was palpable when she saw the tax receipts. "This is remarkable," she said during their first meeting at the Fulton County Records Office. "These tax records provide a clear paper trail. Now we need to trace what happened to the property after 1928. The search through county records was tedious but methodical. Sarah guided them through decades of property transfers, tax liens, and ownership changes. They traced the property through various databases, cross-referencing lot numbers, tax districts, and geographical descriptions. Then they found it. The record was buried in a 1931 file marked "Property Status Changes." The entry was brief, almost dismissive. Lot 47, Tax District 12, ownership status, inactive. Previous owner, Thomas Harris, deceased. Property reverted to county control due to abandonment. Subsequently transferred to private ownership. Abandonment? Terrence's voice rose. What does that mean? We have tax receipts showing he paid through 1928. Sarah frowned as she pulled up additional records. According to this, Thomas Harris was declared deceased in 1930, and the property was deemed abandoned because no heir came forward to claim it. But look at this. She pointed to another entry. 6 months later, the same property was registered under the name Whitfield Development Company. The room fell silent as the implication sank in. Denise's hands trembled as she reached for the stack of tax receipts. Thomas Harris died in 1932. I remember Grandma talking about his funeral. How could he be declared deceased in 1930? Dr. Chambers, who had been quietly taking notes, looked up with a grim expression. I think we need to dig deeper into this Whitfield Development Company. Something about this timeline doesn't add up. 3 weeks of additional research revealed a disturbing pattern. Whitfield Development Company had acquired 17 properties in similar circumstances between 1929 and 1933, all previously owned by African American families, all declared abandoned after the owners were prematurely listed as deceased or missing. The company's records showed connections to several prominent white businessmen who served on Atlanta's Planning Commission and had ties to local banks. What emerged was a picture of systematic land acquisition during the Great Depression, when legal challenges would have been nearly impossible for black families to pursue. They stole it, Denise said simply, staring at the documentation spread across the conference table. They literally stole our family's land. But the most shocking discovery was yet to come. When Sarah traced the current ownership of the original Harris property, they learned it now housed a thriving commercial complex worth an estimated $4.2 million, a shopping center with restaurants, retail stores, and office space in one of Atlanta's fastest-growing neighborhoods. For over 90 years, the Harris family had believed they were descendants of poor sharecroppers, never knowing they were actually the rightful heirs to prime real estate in the heart of Atlanta. For over 90 years, the Harris family had believed they were descendants of poor sharecroppers, never knowing they were actually the rightful heirs to prime real estate in the heart of Atlanta. "The question now," Dr. Chambers said, looking around the table at the faces of Thomas Harris's descendants, "is what are we going to do about it?" The breakthrough that would change everything came from an unexpected source. Terrence's wife, Monica, worked as a bookkeeper for a small accounting firm that specialized in estate settlements. When she heard about the family's discovery, she suggested they examine old bank records to trace the financial trail. "If your great-great-grandfather was paying property taxes for over 20 years, he had to have banking relationships," Monica explained over dinner. "Banks keep records forever, especially from that era. And if there was fraud involved, the money trail will tell the story." Dr. Chambers arranged for them to meet with David Chin, a forensic accountant who volunteered his services for historical justice cases. David's specialty was following paper trails through decades-old financial records, and he'd helped several families recover assets lost to various forms of discrimination. Their first stop was the Georgia State Archives, where bank ledgers from the 1920s and 1930s were preserved in climate-controlled storage. David guided them through boxes of handwritten entries, teaching them to recognize the accounting practices of the era. "Here," David said, pointing to an entry in a 1931 ledger from Citizens Trust Bank. "Thomas Harris, account number 4472. Look at this entry from March 15, 1931. The entry showed a mortgage payment of $240, a substantial sum for that time period, with a notation. Final payment. Property lien satisfied in full." Denise felt her breath catch. "He paid off the mortgage just 6 months before they declared the land abandoned?" "That's exactly right," David confirmed. "But look at this." He flipped several pages forward to September 1931. Another entry showed the same property being mortgaged again, but this time under Whitfield Development Company for $180. "They remortgaged our grandfather's property after stealing it," Terrence said quietly, his voice barely containing his anger. "And they got it for less than what he had just finished paying." But the most damning evidence was yet to come. David had requested access to Whitfield Development Company's banking records through a legal research provision. What they found was a pattern so systematic it took their breath away. The company's ledgers showed property acquisitions from 17 different African American families between 1929 and 1933. In every case, the pattern was identical. Families would make their final mortgage payments, the properties would be declared abandoned within 6 months, and Whitfield would acquire them for 60 to 80% of their previous value. This wasn't random, Dr. Chambers observed, studying the timeline. This was organized. Someone was systematically monitoring black-owned properties and orchestrating their theft during the Great Depression. Their investigation led them to the Fulton County Courthouse, where they requested access to the original property transfer documents from 1931. Sarah Mitchell, their archivist friend, had prepared them for what they might find, but the reality was still shocking. The transfer documents showed Thomas Harris's signature releasing the property to Whitfield Development Company. But when they compared it to signatures on the tax receipts and letters they'd found, the difference was obvious even to untrained eyes. "The handwriting doesn't match at all," Denise said, placing the documents side by side. "Look at how he writes his T. It's completely different." Dr. Chambers contacted Professor Janet Williams, a handwriting expert at Georgia State University who specialized in historical document analysis. Professor Williams examined the signatures under magnification and ran them through comparison software designed for forensic analysis. Her conclusion was unequivocal. These signatures were written by 2 different people. The signature on the property transfer documents is a clear forgery. The pen pressure, letter formation, and natural flow are completely inconsistent with the authenticated samples. But the most shocking discovery came when they traced the ownership of Whitfield Development Company itself. Corporate records showed the company was owned by 3 men: Robert Whitfield, a prominent Atlanta businessman; James Morrison, who served on the City Planning Commission, and Charles Drummond, a loan officer at Merchants and Farmers Bank. They had access to everything, Sarah Mitchell explained during their final research meeting. Drummond could monitor mortgage payments and identify when properties were paid off. Morrison could manipulate city records and property classifications. Whitfield provided the business front and capital for acquisitions. The scope of their operation was breathtaking in its calculated cruelty. They had specifically targeted black families during the Great Depression, knowing that legal challenges would be nearly impossible to mount. The forged documents, false death certificates, and manipulated property records created a nearly perfect system for land theft. "What's most heartbreaking," Dr. Chambers said, reviewing their findings, "is that this happened right after Thomas Harris achieved his dream. He'd worked for decades to own that land, finally paid off his mortgage, and they stole it within months of his greatest triumph." Terrence discovered the final piece of the puzzle in a 1933 Atlanta Constitution newspaper article archived online. The headline read, "Development Company Announces Major Commercial Project." The article described Whitfield Development Company's plans to build modern commercial facilities on recently acquired land near the railroad tracks. The accompanying photograph showed groundbreaking ceremonies for what would become the shopping center that currently occupied the Harris family's stolen land. In the photo, Robert Whitfield, James Morrison, and Charles Drummond stood smiling beside a sign that read, "Future site of Whitfield Commercial Center." They were celebrating their theft in the newspaper, confident that no one would ever question their acquisition of the property. 94 years, Denise said softly, staring at the photograph. "For 94 years, they've been profiting from our family's land while we believed we were descended from people who owned nothing." The evidence was overwhelming, undeniable, and heartbreaking. But now they faced the most difficult question. After nearly a century, was there anything they could do about it? Dr. Chambers looked around the room at the faces of Thomas Harris's descendants, people who had grown up believing their family history was one of poverty and struggle, only to discover it was actually a story of success, pride, and systematic robbery. "There's one more place we need to look," she said quietly. "We need to go to the actual property. Sometimes the land itself holds secrets that documents can't reveal." The Whitfield Commercial Center buzzed with activity on the sunny Tuesday morning when Dr. Chambers, Denise, and Terrence arrived for their site visit. Shoppers moved between the Target, Starbucks, and various restaurants that now occupied the land where Thomas Harris had once grown cotton and raised his family. The irony wasn't lost on any of them. "It's hard to imagine this was ever farmland," Denise said, looking across the busy parking lot. "Everything looks so permanent." Dr. Chambers had arranged the visit through the property management company, explaining they were conducting historical research for the university. The current owners, a real estate investment firm based in Charlotte, had been cooperative when shown the documentation about the property's history, though they seemed puzzled about why anyone would be interested in a routine commercial development. Marcus Rodriguez, the property manager, met them at the main entrance. "Dr. Chambers? I'm Marcus. I pulled together what historical information we have about the site, though honestly, it's not much. The shopping center was built in 1987, and before that, the land was vacant for decades." "Vacant?" Terrence questioned. "What about the original development from the 1930s? Marcus looked confused. "I'm not aware of any development from that era. According to our records, this was just empty land until our company purchased it in 1985. Dr. Chambers and the Harris descendants exchanged glances. Even the current property owners had no knowledge of Whitfield Development Company or the original theft. The cover-up had been so complete that the crime had been erased from the property's official history. "Would it be possible to walk around the perimeter of the property?" Dr. Chambers asked. "We're looking for any original markers or boundaries that might still exist." Marcus shrugged. "Sure, but I doubt you'll find anything. The whole area was cleared and leveled before construction." They began their search at the northeastern corner of the property, where Thomas Harris's letters had mentioned the fence line that bordered the railroad tracks. The tracks were still there, now part of Atlanta's MARTA system, but any trace of the original fence had long since disappeared. Working systematically, they walked the entire perimeter of the 3-acre site. Most of the boundary was clearly defined by modern landscaping, concrete barriers, and adjacent properties. But at the southwestern corner, behind a row of dumpsters and partially hidden by overgrown bushes, Terence noticed something unusual. "Hey, come look at this," he called out, pushing aside thick vegetation. What he'd found was a granite stone, roughly 18 inches square, partially buried and covered with decades of dirt and leaves. It was clearly old, much older than the shopping center, and appeared to be some kind of marker or monument. Dr. Chambers knelt beside the stone and began carefully clearing away the accumulated debris. "This could be a property cornerstone," she said excitedly. "In the early 1900s, landowners often marked their property boundaries with engraved stones." As they cleared more dirt and vegetation, carved letters began to emerge from the weathered granite surface. The first letter was clearly a T, followed by what appeared to be an H. Denise gasped. "Th. Thomas Harris." Working together, they cleared the entire stone. The inscription read, "Th. 1905. In simple block letters, exactly the type of property marker that would have been used to establish land boundaries in the early 20th century. "This is it," Dr. Chambers whispered. "This is proof that Thomas Harris not only owned this land, but that he marked it, claimed it, made it his own." But their discoveries weren't finished. As they continued searching the area around the cornerstone, Terence found the remains of what appeared to be an old tree stump, hidden behind a maintenance shed. The stump was massive, clearly from a tree that had been decades old when it was cut down. And embedded in the weathered wood was a rusted chain, the kind that would have been used to tether livestock. Denise pulled out her phone and scrolled through photos of the family letters they'd discovered. "Here," she said, her voice trembling with excitement. "In the 1922 letter to Aunt Sarah, Grandpa Thomas wrote about the tether oak behind the home where he kept the milk cow." The chain was exactly where Thomas Harris had described it over a century ago. Dr. Chambers stood in the shadow of the Target store, looking from the cornerstone to the tree stump to the railroad tracks in the distance. "The physical evidence aligns perfectly with the written records. This removes any doubt about the authenticity of your family's claim to this land." As they prepared to leave, Marcus, the property manager, approached them with a puzzled expression. "Find anything interesting?" "More than we expected," Dr. Chambers replied diplomatically. "You know," Marcus said thoughtfully, "there's something I probably should have mentioned earlier. When they were doing foundation work for the current shopping center in 1987, the construction crew found some old building materials buried on the site. Brick fragments, pieces of wood siding, things like that. The developer assumed it was just construction debris that someone had dumped years earlier." Denise and Terence looked at each other with the same thought. Those weren't construction debris. They were the remains of Thomas Harris's house, the home where the 1920 family photograph had been taken, the place where he'd lived and worked and raised his family on his own land. "The house was demolished," Terence said quietly. "They tore down our great-great-grandfather's house and buried the pieces." As they walked back to their cars, the weight of their discoveries settled over them. They now had overwhelming evidence that Thomas Harris had legitimately owned this land: the original photograph with the deed, the tax records, the forged transfer documents, the bank records, the handwriting analysis, and now physical proof in the form of the cornerstone and tether chain. But perhaps most importantly, they had something that couldn't be forged or stolen or erased from official records. They had the truth. "So what happens now?" Denise asked as they stood in the parking lot where her great-great-grandfather had once tended his crops. Dr. Chambers looked around at the thriving commercial development, at the hundreds of shoppers going about their daily lives, unaware they were walking on land that had been stolen from a black family nearly a century ago. "Now," she said, "we decide whether we're going to let this story end here, or whether we're going to fight for justice." The cornerstone with Th. 1905 had waited 94 years to be discovered. Thomas Harris's descendants had a choice to make about what to do with the truth they'd finally uncovered. 6 weeks after discovering the cornerstone, Denise sat in the law offices of Patterson and Associates, surrounded by boxes of evidence that told the story of her family's stolen legacy. Across from her, attorney Rebecca Patterson reviewed the documentation with the methodical precision that had made her one of Atlanta's most respected civil rights lawyers. "I've seen cases of historical land theft before," Rebecca said, setting down the handwriting analysis report, "but rarely with this level of documentation. You have an extraordinary case here." The decision to pursue legal action hadn't been easy. Terrence had initially worried about the cost and complexity of challenging a 90-year-old injustice. "What if we spend our life savings and get nothing?" he'd asked during one of their family meetings. But Denise had been adamant. "This isn't just about us," she'd argued. "Thomas Harris worked his entire life for that land. He deserves to have his legacy acknowledged. And what about other families? If we don't stand up to this, how many other stolen properties will never be challenged?" Dr. Chambers had connected them with Rebecca Patterson after researching attorneys who specialized in historical property disputes. Rebecca's firm had successfully resolved several cases involving land taken from minority families during the Jim Crow era, and she immediately recognized the strength of the Harris family's claim. "The key advantage you have," Rebecca explained, "is that this wasn't a legal taking under eminent domain or foreclosure. This was outright fraud. There's no statute of limitations on stolen property, especially when the theft was concealed through forged documents." Rather than filing a traditional lawsuit that could take years and generate unwanted publicity, Rebecca recommended pursuing the case through Georgia's Adverse Record Correction Statute, a legal provision designed to address historical errors in property records. This approach would be quieter, faster, and more likely to result in a negotiated settlement. "The beauty of this approach," Rebecca continued, "is that we're not asking a court to reverse 90 years of property law. We're simply asking for official recognition that the original transfer was fraudulent and that your family retains an ownership interest in the property." The legal filing was comprehensive, including the original photograph, tax records, bank ledgers, handwriting analysis, and photographs of the physical evidence. Rebecca also commissioned a historical land survey that confirmed the cornerstone and tree stump were located exactly where Thomas Harris's property boundaries would have been according to the 1904 deed. The response from Meridian Properties, the current owners, was surprisingly positive. David Kim, their corporate attorney, requested a meeting after reviewing the evidence. "My clients had no knowledge of the property's history," Kim explained during their first negotiation session. "Meridian purchased this land in good faith from the previous owners. However, we recognize the validity of your historical claim and the injustice your family suffered." What Denise and Terrence hadn't expected was how cooperative the business community would be once the facts were presented. The shopping center's anchor tenant, Target, issued a statement supporting efforts to address historical injustices and expressing willingness to work with all parties toward a fair resolution. The breakthrough came when Rebecca proposed a creative solution that would benefit everyone involved. Rather than seeking to disrupt the existing commercial development, the Harris family would accept a 25% equity stake in the shopping center, providing them with ongoing revenue while allowing the current businesses to continue operating. "This approach honors your great-great-grandfather's vision," Rebecca explained to the family. "Thomas Harris wanted this land to provide for future generations. Now it will, just in a different way than he imagined." The settlement negotiations took 3 months, but the final agreement exceeded everyone's expectations. The Harris family would receive a 25% ownership stake in the Whitfield Commercial Center, annual revenue distributions estimated at $180,000, a designated memorial space honoring Thomas Harris and other families who lost land to systematic theft, full acknowledgement in the property records of the fraudulent 1931 transfer. But perhaps most importantly, Meridian Properties agreed to fund a comprehensive study of other properties in Fulton County that might have been stolen through similar schemes, potentially helping other families recover their lost legacies. The signing ceremony took place on a crisp October morning, exactly 94 years after Thomas Harris made his final mortgage payment. Denise and Terence stood with their children and grandchildren in the same spot where the cornerstone had been discovered, now marked with a beautiful memorial garden. Thomas Harris never got to see his great-grandchildren, Denise said, her voice thick with emotion as she signed the settlement documents. But somehow, his determination to own this land is still providing for them today. Rebecca Patterson had insisted on one additional element in the settlement: the establishment of the Thomas Harris Foundation, funded by a portion of the family's settlement, dedicated to helping other families research and recover stolen properties. "Your great-great-grandfather's legacy isn't just about this land," she told the gathered family members. "It's about the precedent you're setting for others who've been told their families own nothing when they actually owned everything." The story had taken an unexpected turn from tragedy to triumph, but not through revenge or public spectacle. Instead, it had been resolved through patient research, compelling evidence, and a commitment to justice that honored both the past and the future. As the ceremony concluded, Terence looked around at the thriving shopping center, at his family's children playing in the memorial garden, at the plaque that would forever commemorate Thomas Harris's rightful ownership of this land. He would have been proud, he said quietly. Not just of getting the land back, but of how we got it back. The quiet resolution had accomplished something more valuable than mere financial compensation. It had restored Thomas Harris's dignity, and ensured his legacy would benefit generations to come. 1 year later, Dr. Lena Chambers stood before a crowd of 300 people in the Grand Hall of the National Museum of African American History and Culture in Washington, D.C. Behind her, illuminated by carefully positioned spotlights, hung the 1920 Harris family photograph that had started everything, the image that had waited 105 years to reveal its secrets. The photograph was now the centerpiece of a new permanent exhibit called Hidden Deeds: Recovered Stories of Black Land Ownership. Beneath it, a bronze plaque read, "Thomas Harris Family, 1920. One photograph. One folded deed. One family's lost history found again." This photograph represents something profound, Dr. Chambers told the gathered audience of historians, civil rights leaders, and families who had traveled from across the country. "It reminds us that our understanding of history is only as complete as the evidence we're willing to examine closely." In the front row sat Denise and Terence with their extended family, children, grandchildren, and cousins who had grown up believing they were descendants of poor sharecroppers. Now they knew the truth. They were the heirs of Thomas Harris, landowner, taxpayer, and a man who had achieved the American dream only to have it stolen through systematic fraud. The past year had transformed their lives in ways they never could have imagined. The quarterly revenue checks from their ownership stake in the Whitfield Commercial Center had allowed Denise to retire early from her job as a school cafeteria worker. Terence had used his portion to start a small construction business, naming it Harris and Sons, in honor of his great-great-grandfather. But the financial impact was only part of their story. The Thomas Harris Foundation had already helped 12 other families research and document their own cases of stolen land. 3 had successfully recovered properties or reached settlements, while others were still working through the legal process. Each case had uncovered similar patterns of fraud, forged documents, and systematic theft targeting black families during the Great Depression. "What we've learned," explained Sarah Mitchell, who now served as the Foundation's research director, "is that the Harris case wasn't unique. It was part of a coordinated effort to dispossess black families of their property during the 1930s. Conservative estimates suggest that over 2,000 families in Georgia alone may have lost land through similar schemes." The exhibit featured displays showing how modern technology could reveal hidden details in old photographs. Visitors could use interactive screens to zoom in on historical images, searching for clues that might unlock their own family mysteries. The most popular feature was a recreation of Dr. Chambers' computer screen, showing the enhancement process that had revealed the property deed in Thomas Harris's hands. 8-year-old Marcus Williams, Denise's grandson, had become the family's unofficial tour guide for visitors to the Memorial Garden back in Atlanta. He could recite the entire story from memory, always ending with his favorite part. "And then they found great-great-great-grandpa's rock with his initials on it, right where he put it in 1905. The children in the family now grew up with a completely different understanding of their heritage. Instead of stories about poverty and struggle, they learned about Thomas Harris's determination, his success as a landowner, and his family's quiet strength in recovering what was rightfully theirs. The photograph had also sparked academic interest far beyond what Dr. Chambers had anticipated. Universities across the country were now using enhanced imaging technology to examine their own collections of historical photographs, searching for similar hidden evidence. The Harris Method, as it had become known, was being taught in graduate programs for history and archival science. But perhaps the most meaningful recognition came from an unexpected source. The city of Atlanta had officially renamed the street running alongside the shopping center Thomas Harris Way, with a ceremony attended by the mayor and city council members. Thomas Harris represents the best of Atlanta's spirit, the mayor had said during the dedication. He worked hard, achieved success, and even when that success was stolen from him, his legacy endured. Today, we ensure that his name and his story will be remembered forever. Standing in the museum, looking at the photograph that had changed everything, Denise felt her great-great-grandfather's presence. Thomas Harris had posed for that picture in 1920, proudly holding his property deed, never knowing that one day his descendants would need that image to reclaim what was theirs. He knew, she whispered to Terence as they stood before the exhibit. Somehow, he knew that photograph would matter someday. That's why he held on to that deed so tightly. The story had gone viral not because of drama or sensationalism, but because it resonated with something deeper. In a world that often seemed focused on conflict and division, the Harris family's story offered hope. It showed that justice could prevail, that truth could emerge from the shadows, and that dignity and perseverance could triumph over injustice. As visitors filed past the photograph throughout the day, many stopped to read the final panel of the exhibit. The Harris family story reminds us that family photographs are more than just images. They are witnesses to history, keepers of truth, and sometimes, the key to recovering what we never knew we had lost. The 1920 photograph continued to draw viewers, but now it told a complete story. Thomas Harris's proud expression and firm grip on his property deed finally made sense. He hadn't just been posing for a family portrait. He had been leaving evidence for future generations, a message that would take 105 years to decode but would ultimately restore his family's rightful place in history. In the end, it wasn't just about land or money. It was about truth, dignity, and the power of one photograph to change everything.